Hello, insatiable listeners. Allie here. I want to let you know about my A Path Forward workshop that I'll be presenting live in the cities of Los Angeles, San Francisco, Philadelphia, New York, and Denver. Traditional goals like lose 30 pounds or cut out sugar do not work for the seasoned dieter. What those do is it gives you more rules, more restriction, and more rebellion, and that gives all the power to the food. In A Path Forward workshop, you will learn your one true goal that gives you the power and enables you to achieve your health and weight loss goals. I hope you'll join me in these live workshops as I'd love to meet so many of you in person. Visit my website, allieshapiro.com, A Path Forward workshop for all the details and to sign up. I can't wait to meet you.
I think that creativity, creative expression, self-expression is necessary for emotional health because we are what we make. And if we don't make anything, we're not going to know who we are. And if we don't know who we are, that enables other people to tell us who we are. And that is very dangerous. Attention is very empty, really. And yet when it's all you have, you kind of think that it's oxygen because when it's taken away from you, suddenly you're in the cold and the dark and you feel invisible.
Battling food and your body doesn't work. You want to love and accept yourself. And because you're insatiable, you want results too. And wouldn't you know, you bring the same intensity to your life, wanting to maximize your time, potential, and experiences you have here on this beautiful and wondrous planet Earth. Fair warning, it will be a roller coaster, but for those insatiable, that's your prime time to thrive. We're here to say yes to the hunger of wanting it all. I'm your co-host, Allie Shapiro, a health coach who helps people end the losing battle of dieting and find a truce with food.
And I'm Juliette Berg, nutritionist, fitness expert, and the co-owner of Unite Fitness Studio franchise.
Welcome, insatiable listeners, to episode 63, How Stifling Your Story Causes Crazy Eating with Justine Musk. Justine is a writer of fiction and nonfiction, a speaker of 2 TED Talks, and a divorced feminist mother of 5 boys, who are awesome. Her work has been published by Penguin, Simon & Schuster, and Marie Claire, among others. An answer she wrote about self-made billionaires on Quora went viral and received attention in the New York Times. She blogs at justinemusk.com about how we learn from what's inside us to live with depth, speak art to power, and tell the stories that will transform the culture. In today's episode, Justine and I discuss how telling and healing our story is essential to ending emotional eating, how to not lose your voice when it gets hard, including how Justine survived the online vitriol that came when her divorce to Elon Musk went public, and why creativity is one of the most important prescriptions to discovering and expressing your story. You're going to love this interview. Enjoy. Welcome, insatiable listeners. I am thrilled today to have Justine Musk. Justine, you were on my bucket list of interviews.
Oh, good.
Thank you. So just
cross that off my bucket list, being on somebody's bucket list.
So, Justine, you are a fierce feminist writer. And I remember when I was new to the online world and everyone was kind of love and light and the creative journey. And I was like, oh my God, I'm doing this wrong. And I stumbled upon your writing.
I'm doing this wrong.
Right? That's what you think in the beginning, that there's a right and a wrong way. And I found your writing and I was like, who is this woman? And it was so clear. And it was, wait, this creative life, this sense of power, especially for women, is not all puppies and rainbows.
I know.
And I think what people don't think about is health is one of the most important metrics is power to me in our health and having agency. And your writing is a lot around this and the heroine's journey. And so I wanted to have you here today to talk about your own heroine's journey, how it's different and all of these great things, because for people listening, great writers are also great thinkers. You have such a unique take. So thank you so much for being here. I'm so thrilled.
Oh, my pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So one of the things that you, in one of your TED Talks, you talk about wounded people tell better stories.
Yes.
So will you talk about that? Because I think so many of my clients, they feel like they're alone or they're wrong or, I'm the one who has all this baggage. And then you come out here and say, wait, but that's interesting.
Yes, it
is. So I'd love to hear how you kind of formulated this and what went into that thought process.
Well, we live in a culture that has such an emphasis on positive thinking and positivity. And I have come to believe that all of this emphasis on putting a smile on it and turning your frown upside down and that kind of thing is basically another way of stifling the inner life. It's another way of dismissing everything as, oh, that's drama. Don't bother me with drama. But drama is where the inner life, that's where the soul lives. And that's where those are our feelings that really tether us to reality. Otherwise, we can get lost in the voices in our head that are telling us like a million different things from a million different angles, because not all those voices belong to us, right? We've internalized a lot of them. So, and also as a writer, I know that the whole point of a story, this comes to mind frequently. And whenever I hear people saying, tell your story. And I do the same thing. I say, we have to tell our stories, but stories are about struggle, because struggle leads to transformation. And you can't tell that story and how these events that you went through changed you, which is what a story is, without being vulnerable. And being vulnerable is very difficult in this culture because we don't learn how to do it. And I was really struck by this when I took a workshop with a really great writer and teacher named Rachel Resnick. And over I was taking it with some really, really advanced writers. Like they were really good at craft and they had like all the basics down solid. And what really separated people at that level is people who can, as Rachel puts it, and I've as I put it too, writers who can go there, which is writers who can, dig deep beneath all the layers of intellectualization and the kind of the cliched responses that we have to things in the usual scripts, and get at the things that they are afraid to tell, because it's those things that we are afraid to tell that people need to hear, because they're the things that tend to be wrapped in, shame and festering in silence. And we think that it's just, it's us, something's wrong with us. But if we can take those stories out of the darkness and bring them into the light, then we can put them in their proper place, which is in a much bigger perspective. And we can see how, we all share these experiences and we're all basically the same in many ways. And so wounded people, I think one of the reasons why they tell better stories is because when you've been wounded, you've generally been really humbled. And I think you get to a place where you are beyond desperate. I think it's just because you've kind of you've learned about the value of surrender and the value of kind of opening yourself up to receive something, because what you have isn't working. And so you start looking at your life differently, and you're forced to kind of think about yourself differently. And well, if I'm not this person anymore because of these things that happened to me, well, then who am I? So I think that creates the space where you're kind of willing to explore a new response to things and tell a new story. And when that story is coming from a place of authenticity and pain, that's what other people can relate to, because we always want to find those stories that we see ourselves in, those stories that connect with our inner lives.
Yeah. And I think that's, you write a lot about the heroine's journey. And for listeners, there's Joseph Campbell wrote, he was this mythologist and he outlined the hero's journey, which we know that in our American culture. Maybe we don't know the hero's journey, but in the Quora post that you wrote that went viral, you talked about Steve Jobs and your ex-husband, Elon Musk, and all this stuff. We know these external stories, but the heroine's journey, which I think men and women to really go through go through the healing and the gifts of the wound, have to go through a heroine's journey, which is it's so much more internal, and we don't see those. I mean, even I remember I did my research on you, and you talked about when you were a girl writing, and like you sensed that the stories that you wanted to read weren't there. And I think that's largely because women's voices and the story often that goes with the descent of the heroine's journey is absent, because we don't want to know about struggle. We just want to know about the upward mobility, right? Like, let's just go from the failure to the commercial success.
That's true. And I think I've come to believe that, I no longer think of it as the hero's journey. I think of it as the heroic journey, because I think, one thing that Campbell did do was that, he was a guy. He was interested in his perspective, and he was coming from his perspective, which was a very male perspective. And to him, women were like the destination. Like, women didn't have to go on a quest, because we were what the questers were coming towards, right? We were their rewards. And so I can't think of any woman I know who would agree with that. We are on our own quest too. Like, everyone is on a quest. And somehow, like that when you look at the heroine's journey, what it is it's the descent into the underworld. And of course, heroes take it too. It's all part of the same journey, the heroic journey. And it just so happens that It is the inward journey. It's like it's the psychological complement to the external journey, and it all goes together. And so it just happened to be gendered. It's yin and yang. So you've got the yang going out into the world and killing the dragons or whatever, and then you've got the yin, which is inward. And it's also about, it's about having things happen to you that kind of like rip you apart or like, well, that's a very strong phrase, but basically that strip away all the layers of your identity until you're kind of until you really are your most naked self. And then you have to reintegrate all these parts of yourselves that you exiled long ago. And so it's all about how your struggle turns you into the kind of person who can become the kind of person who can achieve success in the external world. You can't separate one from the other, and yet we are a culture that does that. And so I think as a result of that, you get people who think that they can go on external quests and slay the dragons or get the reward or whatever, and yet they don't transform. So they don't get that depth of soul that's supposed to come along with the rewards, and that allows them to go back to the community and restore their community or transform their community, because that's the end point of the heroics journey. It has to do with community. It's not just personal glory. But then with women, the heroine's journey was acceptable because you don't go anywhere as a woman. You go down, you go up, you transform, and then supposedly you transform in ways that forces the people around you to transform and your community to transform, because you change part of the system is forced to change around you. But there's no next act there. So it's like we need women to, go out into the world and kill dragons or slay dragons or, like take the reins of power. We need women to do that too. And we need men to, go down into the depths of themselves and deal with their woundedness and their vulnerability and evolve and transform. So it's all about becoming whole as a human being. And somehow we've just kind of disconnected the two. And I think that's a real shame. And I think that's causing a lot of damage in the culture and a lot of damage to men and to women.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we use the word feminist, people think it's like you're against men. And it's like, no, you're not benefiting from this either.
That's a shame. I mean, the enemy of feminism is not men. The enemy is a political system known as patriarchy, in which the feminine is devalued, whether it expresses itself through men or through women. So it's just part of the way that feminism as an idea or as a movement has really been, distorted and well, as and just absolutely, I don't know what to say, like trashed, so that women who are feminists in terms of what they believe in, and I don't know many women who aren't, still feel like the movement has nothing to do with them or that these ideas have nothing to do with them. But it's equality. That's all it is. Feminism is about equality, the same but different, different but equal.
Well, yeah. And I feel like if you really go on a heroic journey, and I love the calling it a quest, because it's not linear, right? When we say journey, we think it's like,
it's true. Yeah.
We're like all over the place. Like I've noticed with my clients, because in essence, we go on that heroic quest because to heal the wounds that are causing them then patterns to eat. Their stress response has been is to eat rather than go back and heal how they were wounded. And it could be in various ways. It's we did an episode.
It's kind of like that takes the place of healing, isn't it? Like that's the object or the substitute for healing. It's the object and it's not doing the job that you wanted to do, which is why you're forced to keep going back to it, because it's so, I mean, whether it's eating or shopping or anything else, I mean, it's the core of addiction is that it's not giving you what you need it to give to you because it can't. So
Exactly. But when we do a lot of this emotional stuff, but it's while we're testing and really seeing, trying to find the gift and, they're sensitive. And so we're trying to give them see the gift in the wound, but they have to go out and test in the world, because you can't just change your inner experience without having some sort of real feedback in the world. So I love that. That's a really important point that I just kind of had this aha of, like, you have to have both. Like you can't.
You have to have both.
Because then I imagine I would just be like, turn into a martyr. Like I have all these feelings.
It's kind of like, I'm always struck by how I don't think there's such a clear division between inner experience and outer experience. Like everything that we project onto the external world, that saying that you see what you are, you don't see the world as it is, you see the world as you are. I mean, when you think about what that means, it's like I am the world and the world is me to a certain extent, because I see my own experience reflected back to me. And so I think by exploring the world, you want to find those points where you feel that sense of resonance between the inner world and the outer world, and you feel a pull or attraction, or you feel something that really hits you on a really deep, primal, visceral, emotional level, because I think that's a sign that that can lead you into a deeper part of yourself, and that, can lead to transformation. But it's like you can't have internal exploration, or, you can't explore your soul without exploring the world, because by exploring the world, you are finding out about yourself, and that's part of soul making. So
yeah, I love
that was a bit of a ramble. I have to.
No, I love it. I love this heady stuff. So to kind of break, because for a lot of people who the heroine's journey is the descent,
the descent, into the underworld,
yeah, and for those listening, you're basically find the lost parts of yourself, which I loved. In the beginning of the interview. You were talking about we have all these voices in our heads, and many times it's not ours. It's what people have given us, and then
the voice of the judge, which is definitely not ours, but kills us with perfectionism and criticism, and it's just absolutely brutal.
Yeah. So to
inner tyrant.
Yeah. Oh my God, totally. But the challenge is knowing, my clients are always like, well, what's real life and the judge? It's like, well, the judge gives you no options. It's very black and white, right? It's like, no, this is the kingdom of God or something.
The judge is the loud voice that you hear all the time, very easily, without even trying.
Yeah, that's a great way of describing it. Your soul is much like
your soul's a very tiny voice, the voice of the mouse.
But to bring this to life, will you share with people how because a lot of my clients start to realize that a lot of their food issues are because they've lost their voice, they've lost their preferences. And so will you share about your own heroine's journey, how you really lost your voice from the age of 8 to 13? Because I think that's a lot of us don't even think about going back that far. But the origination of our wounds, I think, often start there. And then if we don't heal the patterns, we just build up the pattern to have more and more armor rather than being vulnerable, right? So will you share with that? Because I think it's so important for people who are trying to find their voice, and what's the judge versus what is my soul? And this isn't a 3-step process.
Well, I was very lucky in a way, because I discovered writing early on. And so even if I didn't feel I had my voice even if I felt like I didn't know how to assert myself or stand up for myself in the external world, and I had a way of being, say, overshadowed by certain other personalities, more dominating personalities, I was always writing. And so I discovered who I was through my writing. And at the darkest time of my life, I kind of came back to myself through my writing. One night I was literally sitting, and this was after I had a baby who died he died of SIDS at 10 weeks. And then I went through a gruesome divorce. And at one point I was sitting, in my bedroom and going through my live journal, which was my first blog, although I don't really know if people consider live journal a blog, but it was what I did for about 7 or 8 years. And I remember just kind of realizing this is who I am, this voice that's in this journal online of all places, this is me. And it was as if my this other self, this writer self, had kind of thrown me a rope to kind of lead me through the maze of what I was going through, and kind of bring me back to the world of the sunlight and daylight. So it's one reason why I believe so much in the value of creative work, no matter who you are or what you do, or no matter what it is that you do. I think that creativity, creative expression, self-expression is necessary for emotional health, because we are what we make. And if we don't make anything, we're not going to know who we are. And if we don't know who we are, that enables other people to tell us who we are. And that is very dangerous. And, and that's when you get into, which voice is, the voice of my soul, and what's real, and what's all of this static that I've picked up because I've been disconnected from the voice of my body. I've been disconnected from my intuition. So no, I'm not sure where to go with that. But
that was really powerful, though. That struck me about if you're not making things and you're not making art, then you create a vacuum. And art can be starting a company, art can be, making music, art can be the relationships that you make with other people. Art can be whatever it is that you feel compelled to make, because it's an expression of who you are, what you're drawn to. And sometimes it takes a long time for your art, the particular expression of your art to come together, because, you have to find the skills, you have to find the medium. I mean, sometimes you don't realize what you are
meant to do until, say, you pick up a violin and it's like, oh, well, this is me. I don't know how, but somehow this is me. Or watercolors, or, you walk into a lab for the first time and, something's really calling to you, but it's that drive toward wholeness. And I think, creativity is a big part of that, because we are called to what is trying to complete us. And it's not another person. It's that part of ourselves that wants to grow and needs to.
Yeah. And I like that you use the word wholeness, because ultimately I think that's what health really is. It's not, are you diagnosis free? Do you weigh this? Are you eating this? It's, are you alive? And alive doesn't mean everything's going your way. I mean, that would be great.
No. And it doesn't mean perfection. And it doesn't mean always being your quote unquote best self. I mean, it means it comes with the mess as well as anything else. I mean, one of my favorite quotes is by Jung when he said, I would rather be whole than good. And
yes, I love Jung.
Yeah.
Ahead of his time.
Oh my God, yes, absolutely, yeah.
My sister's so funny though. She studied like comparative literature in undergrad, and not that, I mean, literature, this is related, but she was like, come on, psychotherapy was starting to look like a Jewish conspiracy. So they brought Jung in so that, they would have like a Goya. And I'm like, that's not true.
He was the bad boy.
I know, exactly.
The others were like, what is this mystical mumbo jumbo? Who are you? But
yeah,
thank God for him. Yeah.
So I think that what you're saying is there can be gifts in the wound, gifts in our wounds, if we really are willing to take that descent and then come back out into the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's kind of like, I was thinking of the saying the other day, the cure is in the wound. And it's kind of like, you look at what's broken you and somehow in that is the answer to what will save you. I mean, I'm not sure that this can apply to every single thing, but I always found that a really intriguing idea. And what always intrigued me about the gift and the wound was how connected I feel that giftedness and woundedness tend to be. I mean, in the people that I've seen and myself, like, for example, I have ADD. I have a brain that doesn't really filter things the way a neurotypical brain does. And so I remember talking to my therapist about this once, and she said, well, that's why you write. You write because your brain requires that in order to organize your experience. Otherwise, everything's just kind of like a jumble in your head. And of course, you look at what creativity is, and creativity is the ability to make unexpected and unusual connections between a lot of different elements. So when everything is coming into your head all at once and like sloshing around in there, it's a lot easier to find relationships between things than if it was just coming, if stimuli was just kind of being filtered in one at a time. So, and I really do believe that's why creativity is so linked to madness, because that's you can present a very unique way of understanding experience and a very creative way of expressing it. And it's like, if it works and other people get it, you're sane. And if it doesn't work and nobody gets it, you're insane. Like that's kind of. So.
I know. Well, I think, that's really interesting, because I think for people listening, I think at the time, I think dieting is kind of
insane.
Yeah. But if you use that, if you realize that there's a wound there, an emotional wound, and it's part of repetition compulsion and trying to
heal something.
Yeah, that same quest can be, rather than, for me, it used to be filled with shame. But then once I realized what it was really about, and going back into, for me, it was health wounds, but I like that. It's like all how the lens you put on it, right? So your madness is dieting. That's okay.
The thing about addiction is that addiction is very rigid, like when you look at how repetitive it is, it's you're doing the same thing over and over and over again. And even though it doesn't work, it feels good in the beginning, but even then it's, you need more and more in order to get like similar effects. And then suddenly you're just doing it to feel normal. And suddenly you're just doing it because you can't not do it. And I think part of that is because you don't know what else to do instead. And so there's and I think because there's so much woundedness behind the addiction that the addiction becomes like a door that you are holding closed against the pain that's, all behind it. And you're afraid that if you remove the addiction or you stop the addiction, then the door is going to like spring open and all this pain will come at you. And yet you have to go through that process in order to find a different way of a different quest, let's say, or finding a way even to get moving on the quest again, because it's like addiction just kind of like yanks you off the path and keeps you in a cave for how many years.
Yeah. And then it's almost like with people who have anxiety, then they have anxiety about the anxiety. It's like, that's what happens with when you keep that.
When you're starting thinking about your thinking about your thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So one of the things about the heroine's journey or the heroic's journey is that you are at some point going to have to go your own way. right? Like you have to be grounded. Yeah. And I thought it was really interesting, and we were kind of laughing before, but you wrote an article in Marie Claire, right? At like in 2010 about being a starter wife. And I'm just going to read a couple.
2010. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But I love this. And I wanted to ask you, how do you pivot? Because from like, how do you stay the course? Because there's so many shiny object detours. And so you wrote, so this was, I mean, I mentioned it briefly, but for people who don't know, you used to be married to Elon Musk, and then was married,
no longer married.
Yeah, previously married. And you wrote a piece for Marie Claire about being a starter wife. And you said, I did
not come up with that title, by the way. I just have to say. So that was somebody else's title, yeah.
It's great. The whole piece is great. And so you said, I barely recognized myself. I had turned into a trophy wife, and I sucked at it. I know. I love that. I laughed out loud. I was like, I wasn't detail-oriented enough to maintain a perfect house or be a perfect hostess. I could no longer hide my boredom. I love this. When the men talked and the women smiled and listened. I wasn't interested in Botox or makeup or reducing the appearance of the scars from my C-section.
Oh my God, yeah.
And then I love this part. You said 1 month. So then you guys went into couples counseling, and you said 1 month and 3 sessions later, he gave me an ultimatum, meaning Elon, either we fix this marriage today or I will divorce you tomorrow, by which I understood he meant our status quo works for me, so it should work for you.
Right.
And, he felt, this was so intriguing to me. He filed the divorce the next morning. I felt numb, but strangely relieved.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you, because here you have, I imagine it's like, I mean, I know in the article you talked about when you guys first got together, it was like it wasn't the glorious that we see now.
No, we were sharing a tiny little apartment an apartment in Mountain View. And we had like this churning succession of roommates, and his car was always breaking down. It was a beautiful car, but it was constantly breaking down. And so where we started was so different from where we ended up. It still amazes me now.
Yeah. But where you guys ended up though, in that process, you lost some of yourself, right? Wouldn't you say that? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And so how do you, I imagine people who are less convicted of themselves would be like, oh my God, I have to give all this up. But you did it, and you were relieved. So is that like a soul moment where it's like, this is a match?
I felt, no, it was absolutely, it was soul survival for me. I really thought that I was dying inside. It was that bad. And I'm getting just choked up just talking about it. It's not the way I wanted it to go. I mean, I never would have wanted to be divorced. I never would have wanted, I was just journaling this morning about my regret that my kids, are not growing up in a so-called normal family where the father and the mother live together, and that whole fantasy of what family life can be like, and I guess sometimes is like, but my kids are not living a normal life, and the parents are not exactly in a normal situation, and that's just kind of how it is. But I know that I did what was right, and I believe that Elon did what was right for him too. I mean, I was not easy to live with, and it was just, the power imbalance was just so severe that it's not like I couldn't speak my mind. It's just that whatever I said didn't mean anything, and that was not who I wanted to be. And I just had this increasing feeling that I was in the wrong life. And which I imagine is a lot like feeling you're in the wrong body, like something is severely wrong here.
And what are your first steps after that? Because I'm imagining some people listening, they're in this rock bottom place, or this is not the way I thought it was going to go. Right. Mm-hmm. I'm still feeling like that about the election. Right.
Yeah.
And how do you start? I mean, you're descended, as part of
ascended, hopefully.
Yeah. It's all of it, right? It's everything.
Well, the thing about the underworld is that you kind of I think one way that the heroine's journey does differ from the hero's journey is it's always presented as one trip down and then one trip up. And I really don't think it's like that, especially for women. I think we go to the underworld a lot. We come back, sometimes we make short trips. Sometimes we make fairly shallow trips. And sometimes we're under for a long time. But if only, and I think about this a lot, particularly with teenage girls, who are experiencing depression and they don't have the bigger adult perspective through which they can frame their experience. And I think, if we just talked as a culture about pain as initiation into like a higher consciousness, if there was just a sense, so that even when you were underground, and if you just had a sense that there's a higher purpose here, that there will be meaning to this, even if I don't see it now, like there is an end point. And so I discovered the heroine's journey I discovered it through the myth of Persephone. And a friend of mine took me to one of those goddess workshops that at the time I would have completely rolled my eyes at. I was like, my God, why am I here? This is so very California. And I was a total snob that way. But one of the goddesses that was presented as an archetype, and this whole thing got me fascinated with archetypes too, was Persephone, and Persephone's story about how, she's yanked into the underworld, and by this event that like literally the earth is crumbling beneath her, like she literally loses the ground beneath her feet and she goes down. But then while she's there, and then there's this whole thing about, her mother going to Zeus and whatever and saying so it's largely her mother's story in a lot of ways, but I was never interested in that part. I was interested in the Persephone part. And I was struck by the fact that when Persephone has a chance to leave, she's been given a, get out of jail, go free card. She actually eats the seeds that require her to go back to the underworld every year. So she ends up spending, because there's this rule in the underworld that anything you drink, anything you eat will bind you to the underworld forever. And I just find it interesting that, Persephone's been down there for, like God knows how long, while all of this drama has been going on, while people are trying to find her and trying to release her from, the contract that Zeus made with Hades over her. And so she hasn't eaten anything. She hasn't been drinking anything. I mean, surely she's been hungry and thirsty, but like somehow she didn't, obviously she knew that there was something. You're in the underworld, you don't eat the food, you don't drink the water. So she has a chance to go, and it's then that she eats some seeds. So I find that very interesting, especially when you compare it to other stories where what one blogger called girl underground stories, where the heroine went underground voluntarily. It was a choice that she made, just like it was a choice that the heroes make. They go into the underworld, they're looking for information, they're looking for, there's a reason why they have to go there. They're on a quest. Right. But Persephone, she's just like, the innocent little damsel who's so innocent that she would never consider going underworld unless she was forced to go there. So talk about, well, I won't get into patriarchy or anything like that, but.
Oh, you can. I really, honestly, it's like a lot of the stories that I try to get my clients to hear, we're basically like getting the patriarchy out of the psyche. It's like, that's part of the healing process. I mean, they wouldn't know. Now they know it, but I mean, once we're in the program, we talk about it. But
the thing about the seeds is that I think that's maybe something left over from an earlier version of the story where, before patriarchy came in and kind of like revised it to be what they needed it to be in order to suit their vision of men and women and what made a really good victim. So, but anyway, long story short, slightly shorter. What really interested me about the Persephone story was that she goes from being a victim to a queen. Ultimately she's like the queen of the underworld. She's pretty powerful. She, shows up in later myths, especially there's one involving another girl named Psyche. And so she's the strong, goth queen. So how does she get from victim to goth queen? And it's that road of, which basically is like, how does she get empowered to be that? And we don't have a story explaining that, which I think is very interesting in this culture. It's like saying, okay, well, take back your power, but it's like, how do you do that? Like, what does that even mean? Empowerment. What does that mean? And so as a result, the word gets used to sell everything from like makeup to plastic surgery to like whatever. Some marketer finds a way to put you can empower yourself if you buy this or if you do this. But anyway, but Persephone actually did become empowered. And so I'm just kind of interested in how she did that. But at the time, what struck me was that how she became a guide to lost souls. So she's down in the underworld. And so in my mind, what she did was that she was in this horrible situation. She'd been kidnapped and abducted and raped. And yet she somehow found meaning in the struggle because what I imagined she did was that she started talking to the people who were down there, or she started encountering, these lost souls. And she was so humbled by the experience in the way that we talked about before, that it's like the pain of others resonated with her because she recognized her pain and their pain. And so it's kind of like, so instead of saying, well, I'm just going to make the best of this, she said, how can I put this to use for other people? How can I use this to help other people? And that gave her a purpose and a way of seeing that even though this wasn't the life that she chose for herself, because she never would have chosen this to happen, that she could still come to terms with it and make something productive of it and become, somebody who was telling her own story instead of having a story told over her or, about her. So that was what I needed to kind of make me realize that, well, my story is going someplace too. And at some point I will also, go back up into the spring world and I can be a guide too. I can use whatever it is that I've learned in order to benefit others. And there's something really healing about that because it connects you to the world outside of yourself and outside of your own pain. And I think that is so important.
It is. And I think that's the ultimate form of agency power is you're going to choose what this means, not what, someone else means or whatever. And I know creating my business is healing to me, emotionally healing to me, as going through chemo and radiation was physically, but it was like, I was no longer a victim of poor environmental regulation because pesticide exposure was a contributor to my cancer. But I was now like, no, this is what it's going to mean. I'm going to help others out of this, and so
this is my dharma, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you bring up such an important point about it's helping others, because I think in the empowerment world and self-help and sisterhood, not all the time, but it kind of turned it in, some of it has turned it into narcissism. It's like more about me. And it's like, no, we heal when we're in community, I think.
We heal when we're in community. And one of the things I've noticed about all of this, tell your story, is that there's so much emphasis placed on individual empowerment, like what it means to tell your story and having a voice and all of that, that we've kind of left out the fact that the reason why we tell stories is to come into community with other people. And the reason why we tell stories is to kind of like weave our personal experience into this larger picture of what it means to be human. And that's how we kind of like figure out who we are, and we relate to each other, and we develop empathy and all of those things that allow us to be human. So there's, we need more of that. We need more talk about community, and we need more talk about context, and we need more talk about how one of the reasons why we need to tell our stories is because stories create context in which we can understand other people that before were maybe like strangers to us. And, this culture is certainly not suffering from an excess of empathy. So I think that would be a very good thing.
Yeah, it was actually my cousins and I, we all celebrate Festivus, and we got on the subject of like white male privilege. And this one woman was saying,
I'm sure that went very well.
Well, actually my cousins are pretty, like, we grew up in a very progressive family, like, but this one woman there that is Lebanese, she brought up a really good point. She was like, no, we need to encourage white people to explore their whiteness so that they can understand that that's an identity, not the norm, or being a male is the norm. And that reminds me of, like, that's when you're telling your story, you're able to say contextually, this is where I fit, whatnot, rather than my pain is all encompassing or my identity is all encompassing. So.
Well, I think one of the things I've noticed about, being a privileged person is, and I was not born into a privileged family by any means. So I've, had experienced life at kind of different price points, for lack of a better way of putting it. And I think what people kind of don't understand is that just because you're privileged doesn't mean you don't have pain. And so I think when we talk about white privilege, the reason why white people are, especially like, white straight men are, just because you're white and straight doesn't mean you're not having difficulty. It doesn't mean your life is going to be easy. And so I think there's this indication that if to be privileged means that your life is painless, and that's not what it means at all. So, and you can be privileged in some areas of your life and not privileged in others. You can walk into a completely different room and be in a completely different group of people, and suddenly your status drops and you have no privilege anymore. But so it because we don't talk about it, we don't really understand those nuances, and we don't get that richness of conversation that would, I think, really help people understand each other's experiences more deeply.
Totally. So speaking of nuance, one of the things that's been so helpful for me in my work is something that you wrote about the difference between attention and recognition.
Yes.
And I love that piece. It was about, you were like trick or treat, like you and your friend were trick or treating.
I remember that, yeah.
Your kids were trick or treating or someone. But I think this is so important when we're telling our story, because sometimes those voices that are other people, we're telling our story from a place of what looks good, which is we want attention, versus the deep meaning comes from recognition. So can you talk a little bit about those differences and why it matters so much?
I think it's basically comes down to the difference between being looked at and being listened to. And
so beautiful.
And this whole, and that this whole, and being looked at doesn't mean you're respected by any means. I mean, I had one incident, and I think I blogged about it or wrote about it a couple of times. I was at a dinner party, and there was a young actress at the table, and she was like gorgeous. And so of course all the men were, and these were like really smart men, really great guys, by the way. And I mean, I really enjoyed knowing them, and I'm certainly not criticizing them in any way, but they were so attentive to her. And they were like listening to her opinions, and they were being like extremely polite and courteous to her. And they were also being very flirtatious, and she was clearly the center of attention. And so she spoke with a lot of confidence about her opinions. But she was also at the table with some of the most, with like extraordinarily smart men, very worldly. And so she got up from the table, and as soon as she left the room, the conversation at the table turned to, her lack of intellect and her personality, and she was being mocked. And then she comes back to the table and she sits down, and suddenly, everybody is just complete attitude change. And then she's like the belle of the ball again. And I was really amazed by that, about how you could have such a mistaken sense of why people are paying attention to you. So attention versus recognition. You get attention for things like, attention is like shock value, or attention is like it's whatever gets you into the room, or it's a powerful thing, but it doesn't have any staying power. There's nothing behind it. Recognition comes to you because of what you do. It's what you achieve, and it's much more satisfying, and it's much more fulfilling. And attention is very empty, really. And yet, when it's all you have, you kind of think that it's oxygen, because when it's taken away from you, suddenly you're in the cold and the dark, and you feel invisible. And, you hear all this talk about women who, get to a certain age and suddenly they feel like they're invisible. But whereas I was always struck by the fact that if you're a guy, that's kind of been the case from day one. Like guys don't get attention for doing nothing except looking good, even though looking good can be a lot of work. It's so much work just to look like, even like mediocre, or, even like, like careless, it's like, oh, you're not vain. You don't do it. I mean, I actually do a lot about, to kind of like maintain things, but I just happen to look like I don't. But anyway,
I tried really hard to look this casual.
That's right. So look this sloppy, it takes so much effort, but no, I forgot where I was going with that. But,
I will say that I think that's the insatiable.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have to interrupt because I know this is where I was going. The point that I wanted to make was that attention is fine and recognition is fine. But I think what happens with girls in particular is that they don't learn to discern between the two. They think that attention is a form of recognition because nobody's teaching them differently. And so as a result, they think that they're being listened to because their opinions are sound, when really they're being looked at and they're being, nobody's listening to them. They're just like looking at them and hoping that they can have sex with them later. You know what I mean? And that's actually like really, and then they get a brutal wake up call when the thing that was commanding such attention for whatever reason is taken away from them. And I live in Los Angeles, so it's taken away, pretty young age. It's the window is not all that big. And then it's kind of like, what have they managed to develop in order to bring to the table now? And so when you don't have that, it's that's when you get addicted to plastic surgery, and that's when you're trying to kind of preserve something that you don't have anymore, and that was actually kind of overrated to begin with. But you didn't know. Who knew?
Yeah, and I think weight loss only thrives as an industry because they sell that attention is everything, right?
Attention is everything, yeah, and and it will empower you.
Yeah,
beauty is empowering. Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking with a client, and she's lost like 30 something pounds through our work. But she's also a really great she's in the medical profession, and she had a really wonderful story of someone that she helped rehabilitate. And we were talking about, she's like, people are starting to notice that I've lost weight, but it feels nothing in comparison to when someone said, oh my God, I can't believe this rehabilitation job you did.
Exactly.
This person, and she's like, it just feels so different.
Yes.
And I'm like, yes, and that's what we need to develop, because the attention is insatiable. It's an insatiable place to be.
Yeah.
So I love.
You can be addicted to attention because you're never going to get enough of it. If that's all, if you're looking to that to feed your self-esteem, it doesn't. And that's why, I've heard more than once, and I've talked to people in the industry. Models are some of the most beautiful women on the planet, yet they're also some of the most insecure people that you will ever encounter in your life, because you're dealing with criteria that is set by an external agency that's constantly telling you whether you measure up or you don't. So that's like, talk about voices. Like empowerment comes from within. It's learning from what is inside you. It's being able to, turn inward and know who you are. And when you know who you are, that's when you know what to do, and everything kind of flows naturally from that. But when you're constantly looking at other people to pick up those cues, of, whether or not you're quote unquote succeeding, like that's when you get into trouble.
And that's where you also lose your own preferences, because you're like externally focused.
And you're trying to be perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing I wanted to ask you. You write about and talk about the fear of being too much. And I know that a lot of my clients, some of the underlying eating issues are a fear of being too much. And so can you riff on that?
I still worry about being too much. I think it's just,
I do too.
Yeah. It's just trained into girls from, I think, a very young age. I can't remember if I ever felt confident about taking up space. If I ever felt like, I'm going to like I remember when one of my older sons, I think he was like 10 or 11, and it was just, we were like getting ready to go to school, but there was some time left. So I turned to him and I said, okay, you've got 15 minutes. What are you going to do with it? And he looked at me and he said, I'm going to be awesome. And I thought that was like,
I love that.
I'm going to be awesome. And I thought that was like and it was so him, you know what I mean? It was just so, he's like this great, charismatic, confident kid. But I was like, would I ever hear a girl his age say that? You know what I mean? Like do girls say, I am awesome, at least when they get to a point where I think that I am awesome. I think that stops around 8 or 9. Or I think that's when they start questioning their awesomeness. And then by the time they're 11 or 12 or 13, they've got the entire culture saying, well, you're not awesome because, you're not this, or you're not this, or you're not that, or you're too much of this and you're too much of that. And so being too much is it's like you can't take anything to extremes. So, you can be good, but you can't be too good, because if you're too good, then you're intimidating, and God forbid that you're intimidating. And if you're intimidating, then nobody's going to like you and nobody's going to love you, and you're going to die a bag lady, or you're going to get eaten by your cats, and, no one's going to find your dead body until there's nothing left of it, or something like that, so you can be too smart as a girl. You can be too athletic. You can be too muscular. You can be too loud. You can be too outspoken. You can be too, opinionated. It's just, I'm not saying that boys can't be too much of anything. Of course they can, but part of being, female, part of being the perfect female has to do with just being conventional, like being this ideal that's not offensive to anybody. The moment that you start to get under somebody's skin, or the moment that you start to, be interesting is,
that's an important point.
Because you're not going to be likable, or rather, you're not going to be liked by everybody. And that's kind of like par for the course, and so until you get used to the fact that you can't be yourself without being too much to somebody who's not going to like you, and that's fine. Until you come to terms with that, you're kind of stuck in this very narrow range of what you can do before you've crossed into a danger zone, according to somebody. That's not you.
And how do you deal with that? Because I've seen your writing. I've done my research on you, and people will often say things about you because of John's ex-husband.
I have my haters, yeah.
Right. And I'm like, I want to defend you. I'm like, fuck you, but how do you deal with that? Because that does wear away at that internal line of what is too much, right? So do you have any tools?
Oh, absolutely.
For how you, I imagine it stings, or I would probably be like, I feel so misunderstood. And I know that's a big fear of a lot of us. But what are your tools, and how do you make sure that you're not letting that line creep back of shrinking?
That's actually a really good question, because I've been thinking about that a little bit. I got forged in fire, I think, because when my divorce was a very long process for reasons I'm not going to go into, but it's about 2 years in the process, it became public. And Elon was a big enough figure that it was interesting to people. And of course, the whole, default storyline that I was a gold digger kicked in. And then people, found my blog, and they told me exactly what they thought of that and exactly what they thought of me, even though they had no idea who I was and had no idea the details of the situation. And in some ways, it was actually a great experience, because it was so eye-opening. Suddenly I became a feminist again, or rather my sense of feminism was reawakened, because it was no longer, misogyny was no longer an abstract concept. It was staring right at me with comments like, I hope you get raped in the parking lot, and die, bitch, die, and you're a waste of skin. And yeah, all of that. And yeah, you can actually go to my live journal. You can find, because I left a lot of it up. So the worst ones I started taking down, and there were so many of them that I thought, well, people should see this, because nobody was having that conversation yet, or it hadn't even started, about how women who express feminist opinions online, how they get attacked and bullied. So when it was happening to me, it was kind of new, you know what I mean? It was, and I wanted people to see this, to see what happens when you take a rock and or you lift up a rock and you see these worms squirming beneath, and maggots, which is kind of how I was seeing it at the time. And because the hatred was so palpable. And it forced me to, and I think I had a couple of advantages in that first of all, I really was a writer, like I'd been trained as a writer and I'd been through workshops. And so I had learned to divorce my writing from my ego to a certain extent. And I'd been like we were talking about earlier, I'd been workshopped and I dealt with editors who had just torn apart my work. And so I knew that it's kind of par for the course. And so I knew that what these people were attacking online wasn't really me. It was this idea that they had of me, that they'd gotten through this character in my journal, and they were bringing their own interpretation to that. And as a feminist, I was very aware of what that interpretation was. Like Eve, women are evil, exploitative, gold diggers, whatever, and men are innocent victims. It was like that story that you hear every single time. Like a woman is either marrying a wealthy man or divorcing a wealthy man or whenever there's like money involved in the picture. Like it's always the woman who has questionable motives. So if anything, that just kind of like fueled my resolve, and that was like proving my point for me, both on a personal level and also the point that I was making through my blog. But it hurt, it really did. Every time I got a comment, it was a blow, and I would have to like absorb it. And sometimes I'd have to cry. And a couple of things helped. And one was I was after Hurricane Katrina, I was in New Orleans with the actress Sophia Bush, and we had gone down to, sorry, it wasn't after Hurricane Katrina. It was, sorry, I'm actually getting a little bit upset. I'm getting a little bit emotional, so I'm kind of like losing my track of thought. But anyway, long story short, Sophia was there and she saw me being upset about the latest comment I'd gotten because like there had been like some new piece that had come up about the divorce. And she told me that on One Tree Hill, the director had forbidden the cast to go online and look at the comments about them because the comments were so vicious. And so she said, one night that she got kind of curious. So she went into this forum and she said she couldn't believe how vicious these takedowns were of her. And so it was like, to get back earlier is what we're saying about this is why you really need to tell your stories. Because you discover, it's not just me, it's here I am thinking that I am burdening, like I am the only person that this happens to. And that's not the case. And this is just something that happens. And this particular case, it happens a lot to women. It certainly happens to men too, but with women, the attacks take on such a level of threat, such a level of venom and and women are vulnerable, I think, in a way that a lot of men aren't. So it's actually really quite brutal, but it forces you to think about why you're doing this in the first place. And it forced me to get very clear on what I believed and what my viewpoint was, and to connect to that bigger picture, because then you become part of a larger cause, and then you're kind of like taking it for the cause, or you're understanding that you represent a certain set of ideas and they're attacking these ideas. And the reason why they're attacking these ideas is this very same reason why it's so important to defend these ideas. And you defend these ideas by embodying them, and by staying in the fight. So I did. And over time, it just kind of petered out. And, and this is another thing I knew too. I knew that eventually people would move on to something else. So, but you really do have to learn how to, it's not that people will always tell you, don't let it bother you, like just ignore it. And I think that's really useless advice because you are going to take it personally because on some level it is personal. What you do learn to do is that you learn to move through it really quickly. And Brene Brown, I think, writes about this in one of her books on shame, because the whole point of these comments is to shame you, to make you feel small and destroyed and ashamed and isolated and alone, and so that you'll like sit down, shut up, go away, whatever. And so there's something very powerful about just kind of feeling the feeling, which is icky and awful, but the more you do it, the better you get at it. And so the feeling passes through you much more quickly. So in the beginning, it would take me like an hour and a half to get over a comment or a day or something. And then by now it can be like a minute to 30 seconds, and if I'm really bothered by it, I might actually, I have taken comments that I've gotten, I've actually posted them on my Facebook page and with no comment whatsoever, just to, get the support and encouragement and the outrage of some of my Facebook friends. And that helps a lot. And that's the thing too. It's like when you can't be, if you're going to stand for something, if you're going to have a strong, interesting, fascinating viewpoint that's fascinating to some people, then you are going to repel a lot of other people. So, you can't have fans and supporters and without having the non-believers. But it's having the believers, like having the people who do support you. That makes everything worth it. And so, one email from somebody who believes in what I'm doing and who's been helped by something that I wrote would just justify every single icky, ouchy feeling or like disgust at some of the responses that I got on my blog. It was a no-brainer. So it was like, I always got enough of that support to keep me solid. So again, community and perspective and being part of something larger than yourself.
Yeah. And what I think is so important about your answer is you're like so smart. You can even understand the narrative that they're projecting onto you. And I think a lot of my clients are super heady.
Well, it wasn't a subtle narrative.
Right. But
it's not a very mysterious narrative. It's not hard to figure out.
Well, but you think in narrative, right? Like I think a lot of people who I'm
true.
learning about narrative from Carlos. Like if you don't know, like, oh, this isn't so much like is how they see the world. But I think for people listening, it's so important. Like you said, like you have to feel it. A lot of my clients are like, I know intellectually that this shouldn't matter, or that they're trolls, or that if I was actually standing in front of them face to face, they may have a different delivery and have a different, but you have to feel it. Otherwise, I think it builds shame, and then you don't feel you don't share your story. You don't share with your tribe, or not your community. So thank you.
You can't. I think it's you cannot repress your feelings. I mean, it doesn't mean that you need to act them out, but you need to acknowledge them and feel them and just let them go. And if you don't feel them, you're not going to let them go. And the thing is too, is that if you suppress all the bad feelings, you also suppress the good feelings too. And I experienced this after the death of my child. I mean, you go numb. And you go numb in order so that you don't have to deal with the pain and the loss and the shock. But then you also don't get the joy, and you don't get the pleasure in the sunlight and the autumn winds and just, like a really good cup of coffee or like a gesture that a friend makes for you. I mean, it's like you're when you go dead in one area of emotion, you go dead all across the board. And so that's no way to live.
Do you find that the more that you become whole and go on these heroic quests, that the bad and good feelings there's less of a good and bad line, and then you're like, I find myself more open to embracing all of it, even when I'm crying, and it's like I know that intellectually I'm like, I know this is necessary, but it also, like, my highs aren't as high and my lows aren't as lows. Like, it's just kind of, the more I do my own internal healing, the more I'm like, I don't have a good or bad charge. It doesn't mean I don't feel pain or anything, but it's
kind of flown around by your feelings.
Yeah, but have you found that too?
I have, actually. I think what I've sensed in myself is a stronger center. In some wisdom traditions, I think they refer to it as a container. So it's like you have this container of stillness and peace, and that can kind of like hold all these really strong, overwhelming feelings. And so if you have a small container, that's when you get like flooded by these strong feelings, and then you act out in ways that you regret. But if you can, like, and this is, meditation and developing powers of concentration and the ability to control your attention. And these are all really important skills to develop. But it's just developing that sense of how to manage your own mind so that you can feel these feelings without being eaten alive by them, which is very hard to do. And I'm not trying to downplay that by any means, but it's just so I've noticed in myself, especially too, I started yoga 3 years ago, and that's made a huge difference. And that led me to meditation and guided visualizations and that kind of thing. And it's been really remarkable, really remarkable. And what's developing in me now is that sense of, I think of it as wild peace. It's peace, but it's not necessarily the peace where nothing is going on around you. It's like it's like being at the center almost of a hurricane. I mean, that's really not, it's kind of like being like a hummingbird. The hummingbird, the middle of the body is like very still and seems to be completely, suspended in air, but then the wings are going so fast that you can't even see them. It's just a blur. So it's like, no matter, your wings are a blur or everything around you is a blur, but in the center, your body is just completely suspended. And I think that's what it means to be centered. And so, and I think that has to do with, like you said, it's just, it's good, it's bad. In the end, it's all good. Everything kind of flows, and everything is temporary and everything is passing. So you're going to feel really bad for a few minutes or for a few months or whatever, but it's going to pass. And that helps too.
Right. Well, and I love how you describe that, because it's like the payoff. I mean, the work that I do with my clients, a lot of them will say, this was challenging. This kicked my butt, and it was so worthwhile. And I think kind of for those of you listening, going on this heroic quest, developing your story, your art, it's worth it if for the only reason of you do develop a bigger container and a stronger center, which ultimately makes you more powerful.
Because and it develops your sense of aliveness. And I think that's the thing, because we're so focused on being happy all the time that I think I really do not think that human beings are meant to be happy all the time. Like, I don't think that's why we're here.
I don't either.
It's about meaning. I think, we want to live lives of meaning, and you can be happy all the time, but then still feel that you've led like this frivolous life, because like what is the meaning or the story that you've made out of it? And when you look at some of the things that give our lives meaning, like having children, like having a newborn baby, I mean, that will kind of kill you sometimes because that's, isolating and difficult work. And yet who would say that's not worth it when you're looking at your child who's like 5 or 10 or 15 or 25 or whatever? I mean, it can be one of the most rewarding things that you ever experience. And, or, achieving any tough goal that involved a lot of struggle. So and again, it comes back to how that struggle changed you and, who you were forced to become because of it. And so I think the purpose of the things that when something bad happens to you, it's well, how is this going to change me, or who am I going to be when I come out the other side of this? And there's something called post-traumatic growth, which I think is really fascinating. And post-traumatic growth is, what Nietzsche said, it's like, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And I think we really are, we're put on this earth to get stronger and stronger. And that requires adversity of some level. And we don't have to go out looking for it because it's going to happen to us anyway. And so it's just, it's part of being human, it's part of life. And that is beautiful. And it comes down to just, being alive. Like, the whole point of life is just to be alive. It's to savor all the elements of your own life and to fall in love with your life because it's yours. And you don't need any other reason to love it just because it's your life. It's nobody else's. It's been handed to you, and you get to experience it. And so, it'll be good, and sometimes it'll be bad, but it's probably always going to be interesting, And
I love that. That's so beautiful. I want to end there. And then I just randomly want to ask you this question, because I was asking it when I was going through this existential reorganizing.
Oh, I like that.
It was like
organizing.
It was, because I was like, what are your beliefs about life after death and spirituality?
Oh, whoa.
I know it's the oddest question to end on. But I've had this feel like, as I've started to be like, a question like, is it worth the growth? Is it worth the pain? Like, if it's, because I think in my mind, I believed in reincarnation, and I thought, oh, well, I won't, the Indigo girls are like, how many lives am I going to have to do to make up for like sins in another lifetime? And I'm like, well, if there is nothing else, do I want to do the work? Do I want to grow? It's hard. So I'm just curious if you're
That's the alternative. I think that's the thing.
Well, that's what I've come to.
I mean, it's like we don't get, stuff is going to happen to you regardless. You know what I mean? It's not like you could, oh, okay, I decided I don't want another, what do they call this? Like, AFGE, another fucking growth experience. Have you heard that phrase? Yeah. No. So you don't wake up one morning and it's like, yes, I feel like another fucking growth experience. So bring it on. I want one. It doesn't work like that, but it's like how we get through it, and it's just kind of like, it's the package that's been handed to us, and some people, and as far as reincarnation goes, or life after death or whatever, I think that the whole point of stories is to take these concepts that kind of like exist outside of our, ken as human beings, but to kind of like package them in a way that we can understand, but they're like, it's like that story of, or it's that saying, when you point a finger at the moon, the finger is pointing to the moon, but then you get obsessed with like the finger itself. And so the finger becomes like the end point, and you forget that actually, no, the finger is like, you're supposed to look past the finger at the moon. The finger is gesturing towards something much bigger. So I think, the stories that we have about reincarnation and, like, do I want it, or all of these things. That's our way of pointing at the moon. You know what I mean? And so we have to remember that it's the moon. We're looking at the moon, and the moon is still a very alien object, and most of us haven't been there. Most of us haven't walked on it, so we don't really know what we're dealing with, but we can approach it through these stories, and we can approach it through these worldviews that enable us to create meaning out of our experience that is rewarding to us, and that helps shape the culture around us in a way that is healthy for other people. And I think that is community, and I think that in and of itself is worth doing, just to do it.
Yeah. So do you think there's anything after? Yes or no?
I do, actually. I think there's.
Good. I want there to be.
I don't. Yeah, I know. Me too. But I think it's probably not like anything that we've, But I was actually, I didn't used to think this, but then I'm working on a novel where it's kind of like it's a thriller. And at first I thought it was going to be a reincarnation story. And then I realized, no, it's kind of a ghost story, but there's this whole sense. But anyway, so I was researching it and I just came across some really interesting writings and books and people that kind of challenged the ways that I had dismissed certain ideas out of hand. And so the conclusion that I've come to is that, the universe is filled with some really freaky stuff, and who am I to say that the freakiness ends here, that there is nothing freaky beyond this point. So I think that the deeper you go down into the rabbit hole, the freakier it gets. And, as we become more scientifically astute, we'll be able to explain more and more of this. But just because science can explain it doesn't mean it's still not freaky. You know what I mean? And so like down the lines, God knows how far the rabbit hole goes. So I don't know if that really answers your question.
It does. No, I love it. I love it. It is. So I think the takeaway is people start writing and speaking your freaky stories.
Yeah, exactly. Namaste. The freak in me honors the freak.
Justine, where can people find your writing? Really, if you guys were getting started and you're thinking, oh my God, I need the inspiration. She has a great TED Talk we didn't even get to on like your deep yes, which I think everyone needs to watch. And again, the importance of telling your story. Where can people find you?
Oh, go to my blog, justinemusk.com. My TED Talk is on that. My TEDx talk is on that blog. And that's kind of my home base. So yeah, because the novels that came out over like a decade ago or something, I feel like they're not really representative of who I am now. So in terms of my books, like wait for the next one, like go to my blog, check out my blog. Sign up for my mailing list.
The ultimate, you're clearly on a creative, evolution. That's like most writers say that. They're like, don't read the writing from before.
Yeah. You know what? I shouldn't degrade my previous work like that. If you like dark fantasy stuff, then, give it a try. Who knows? You might like it. But
I have a lot of clients who do. So definitely check out.
Right. Okay.
and start doing your art, listeners.
Yes. Yeah.
And
you do have something worth saying. You do have something worth saying, and practice makes perfect. So, or, perfect in a good way. Practice leads to mastery, and then anything's possible. So keep at it.
Thank you so much for your time. This was so fun for me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Insatiable podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can connect with us on social media. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Juliet Unite, and Allie at Allie M. Shapiro. M stands for Marie. Please feel free to also email us any questions. We would love to hear from all our listeners. You can reach us at Allie at allieshapiro.com and Juliet at unitefitness.com. We'll see you next time.